Get ready to dive deep into something you might not have heard of before. Abandonment to divine providence. We're going to explore how it might already be happening in your life, even if you've never heard the term before. We'll be using Father Jean-Pierre de Caussade's book as our guide. It's called Abandonment to Divine Providence. And it's all about finding holiness, not in like the big gestures, but in the everyday moments by embracing God's will.
Yeah, what's really fascinating about Caussade is how he kind of like flips the script on what it means to live a holy life. You don't have to become a monk or go off and do all these crazy things. It's about finding that connection with God in the ordinary stuff, the everyday things that we usually just overlook.
Okay, so like doing the dishes or waiting in line at the grocery store.
Exactly. But here's the thing. It all comes down to embracing God's will, even when things are tough. Which brings us to the word abandonment. I know it might sound kind of scary at first, but it's not about just giving up or ignoring your responsibilities.
So you're not saying it's about being passive or ignoring what needs to be done, because I think that's where a lot of people would get tripped up.
Absolutely. It's more about recognizing that God is at work in every single moment, accepting whatever comes your way, and trusting his plan, especially when things don't go the way you expected.
So if it's not about being passive, then how do we actually, I don't know, like practice this abandonment?
Well, Caussade puts a lot of emphasis on seeing every moment, even the small ones, as a chance to grow closer to God. It's about finding him in the details, not just those big dramatic events.
It's like, it makes me think about that analogy that Caussade uses about faith being like the interpreter of God's language. Like it gives us the key to understand what our experiences actually mean.
Yeah, that's such a powerful image. Faith allows us to see beyond just the surface of things and to recognize God's hand at work even when things are painful. Like think about Mary at the foot of the cross. Can you imagine the strength of her faith
What?
to be able to see beyond just the brutal physical reality of what was happening and to see the divine purpose unfolding?
It's a pretty powerful example. Even in his suffering, she was able to see Jesus and to stay with him, which kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier, about seeing God's hand in all things, good and bad. But how do we actually start to do that in our own lives?
Well, Caussade really believed that God reveals himself just as much in the ordinary as he does in the extraordinary. He even compared the present moment to an abyss of God's will.
Okay, I got to stop you there. Abyss seems like a pretty intense word to use. What did he mean by that?
Well, he's getting at the idea that God's will is vast, limitless. Each moment is like an entry point into that vastness and holds the potential for us to discover those limitless blessings that he talks about.
So it's not just about accepting whatever happens,
Yeah,
but actually like seeking God's will in every moment.
exactly. And here's where things get even more interesting. Caussade suggests that if we're only focused on what we can see and hear and touch, we might miss what God is actually doing.
So we can get so caught up in the externals that we miss that deeper connection with God.
Yeah, and it's like anything else in life that's really worthwhile. Relationships, skills, you name it. Growing spiritually takes effort. It takes attention. He even says that what we often see as setbacks or obstacles might actually be God's way of refining us. You know how gold has to be purified by fire.
Right.
It's not a fun process, but it's how its true beauty comes out.
You know, that makes me think about the story of Joseph in the Bible. Being sold into slavery by his brothers seemed like such a terrible tragedy. But it ended up leading him to a position where he could save countless lives, including his family's during the famine. So what looks really bad on the surface can actually be part of a much bigger, more beautiful plan.
Absolutely, that's a perfect example. And it really highlights the importance of humility, which Caussade says is key for recognizing and accepting God's will. It's about admitting that we don't have all the answers and trusting God's wisdom instead. He contrasts Lucifer, who fell because of his pride, with those who find their strength in surrendering to God's plan.
It's like that statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. It looks so impressive from the outside. But then it crumbles at the slightest touch because it's made of weak materials. True strength comes from humility, from recognizing that we don't have all the answers. But how do we actually cultivate that kind of humility? It's one thing to talk about it, but it's a whole other thing to actually live it out.
That's where the rubber meets the road, right? It's definitely a process. But Caussade offers some really practical insights on how to actually do it. He suggests we can start by just admitting that we don't have all the answers. We are not God. And accepting your limitations can actually be incredibly freeing.
It's like admitting that we're not superhuman, which, let's be honest, we're not. But even just recognizing that can be hard sometimes.
Absolutely. And that's where grace comes in. One really practical step he recommends is practicing gratitude. When you focus on what you do have, your whole perspective changes. It helps you to let go of that need to control things, to stop comparing yourself to others, and to stop focusing on what you lack.
Yeah, it's like that saying, comparison is the thief of joy.
Yeah,
Gratitude helps us appreciate the gifts we do have, even the little ones.
exactly. Another thing he highlights is the importance of silence and solitude.
Okay, I can see how that could be helpful. But it also sounds really hard in today's world. We're constantly connected and bombarded with noise.
It definitely takes effort. But even taking a few minutes each day to quiet your mind can make a big difference. It's in those quiet moments, away from all the distractions, that you can really start to hear God's voice more clearly.
So it's not about going and living in a cave, but about finding those pockets of stillness in the midst of our busy lives.
Exactly. Think of it like hitting the pause button on all the chatter in your head, so you can tune in to what the Holy Spirit might be saying. Now, when it comes to dealing with difficult situations, Caussade has some really wise advice. Instead of immediately reacting or trying to fix things, he suggests you pause and offer that situation to God.
It's like taking a deep breath before diving into the deep end of the pool. It gives you a moment to center yourself, to remember that you're not alone.
Exactly. And then you can ask for his guidance, for the wisdom to know what to do, even when it's hard.
So it's not about being passive, but about acting in cooperation with God, letting his will guide your actions.
Yes. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Accepting God's will doesn't mean you become a doormat. It's about understanding that, even when things seem bad, even when people act unjustly, God can use those situations for good.
Like with Joseph, his brothers selling him into slavery was a truly terrible thing. But God used that situation to ultimately save lives.
Exactly. God's ways are not always our ways. He sees the bigger picture.
That makes sense intellectually, but emotionally it can still be really hard to wrap your head around suffering.
Oh, absolutely. But Caussade actually suggests that instead of always trying to avoid suffering, we might try to see it as a potential path to growth and transformation.
So you're not saying we should go looking for suffering, but that it can have a purpose.
Exactly. It can refine us, make us stronger, more compassionate people. Remember, Christ himself embraced suffering, and through it, he brought about redemption.
So you're saying that our own suffering, when it's united with Christ's, can become redemptive, not just for ourselves, but for others too. That's a powerful thought.
It is. When you see suffering through the lens of faith, you start to see it as an opportunity to participate in the mystery of Christ's love and to grow closer to him in your weakness.
It's about finding meaning in the midst of pain, trusting that God is with you, even in those really dark times. But honestly, sometimes it feels so overwhelming, like you're just drowning.
We've all been there. But Caussade reminds us that God's grace is sufficient. He doesn't promise us a life without pain or hardship. But he does promise to be with us, to carry us through it. And sometimes he uses those very experiences to shape us into the people he created us to be.
So it's about trusting that God can take even our brokenness, our mess, and make something beautiful out of it.
That's beautifully said. It's not about pretending everything's okay
Yeah.
or denying the pain. It's about letting God into those difficult places and letting him work in you through them. That's where the real transformation happens.
Okay, so we've talked about recognizing God's presence in every single moment, good or bad. We've talked about accepting his will and the role of suffering. But I'm still wondering, how do we know if we're truly living out this abandonment to divine providence? What does it actually look like?
That is a great question. And Caussade actually offers a few indicators, a few signs that you might be on the right track. One of the key ones he talks about is a sense of inner peace. Not just when things are going well, but even in the middle of challenges.
So like that peace that almost defies logic, that sense of calm in the middle of a storm.
Exactly. It doesn't mean that the challenges disappear, but there's this deep-seated trust in God's goodness and love that helps you through it. It's knowing that no matter what happens, you are held in God's care.
So it's not about feeling happy all the time, but about having that underlying trust that God is in control, even when life feels chaotic.
Yes. And that kind of trust leads to another one of those indicators he talks about, a willingness to embrace whatever God sends your way, good or bad. Joys and sorrows, successes and failures. It's recognizing that all of it plays a part in your spiritual growth.
So it's not about just passively accepting injustice or difficult situations,
Yeah.
but about trusting that God can use them for good.
Exactly. And it's about surrendering your own limited perspective to see things the way God sees them. Trusting that even when you can't see the path ahead, God is with you every step of the way.
You know, it makes me think about how often we try to control everything in our lives
Hmm.
and to make things go according to our plan. But with this idea of abandonment, it's more about surrendering that control to God.
And that surrender,
Mhm.
paradoxically, leads to a much deeper sense of freedom. You're no longer carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders.
That's where those practices we talked about earlier come in, like gratitude and silence, to create space for that surrender, for that connection with God.
Exactly. They help us shift our focus from ourselves and our own desires to God and His will. And when we do that, we become more attuned to His presence in our lives, more aware of His guidance. It's a process, but the more we practice it, the more naturally it flows.
So where do we go from here? Like, what's one concrete step people can take today to start incorporating this idea of abandonment into their lives?
Hmm. I think it all comes down to one question. What would it look like for you to let go of just one thing today and offer it to God instead? Maybe it's a worry that's been weighing on you, a decision you're struggling with, or even just the desire to have a good day. Offer it to God and ask for the grace to trust in His plan.
That's a beautiful challenge. You know, as we've been talking, I've realized that this isn't about being passive or checking out of life. It's actually the opposite. It's about showing up more fully, more authentically, with a deeper trust that God is working in and through us, even when we can't see it.
You said it perfectly. It's about embracing the adventure of faith, knowing that God is the ultimate guide, and that the path He has planned for you, even though it may have its twists and turns, will lead you to unimaginable beauty and joy.
Thank you so much for diving deep into this with us today. We hope this exploration of abandonment to divine providence has been insightful and encouraging for you. Don't be afraid to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep seeking. As you open your heart to God's presence and His plan, you might just be surprised by the amazing journey that unfolds.